Indian children and Spanish expansion in the Maracaibo Basin at the turn of the 18th century. The entrada of Rodrigo Ferreira de Almeida, 1699.
Thank you, Julie, and thanks for being here and giving me the chance to talk to you about some of the research that I've been doing recently. I was on sabbatical in the spring of 2021, and I'm engaged in a project which will culminate, God willing, in the Creek Don't Rise, in the publication of a book looking at Indian-Spanish relations in the Maracaibo region of Western Venezuela in the 18th and 19th centuries. Originally, I'd planned to go to Spain and maybe to Colombia to do research. Obviously, the pandemic got in the way of that, but I was nonetheless able to conduct some research by means of documents that have been digitized and made available online at both the Archivo General de Indias in Spain and the Archivo General de la Nación in Bogota, Colombia. And what I'm going to present today is the result of discovery of a collection of documents, more than 250 pages, of which deal with the event that I'm going to talk about. Really quickly, a kind of geographical orientation. If you look at this map, it's an outline map of the contemporary Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and the area in green on the left side of your screen is the Maracaibo Basin, the area surrounding Lake Maracaibo in the northwestern corner of Venezuela, bordering on northeastern Colombia. And specifically, the area I'm talking about today is basically this area here, lying in what is now the Venezuelan state of Zulia and the department of Norte de Santander in Colombia. So this is the focus of the research that I'm engaged in and what I'll be talking about today. And with that as a kind of geographical orientation, here's just an image of a couple of the pages of this 250 plus page document that forms the basis of the talk. This is a document relating to an entrada, a sort of military expedition by the Spanish against a hostile and independent group of Native Americans known by the Spanish as the Motilones. And this entrada gave rise to a court case, which is the reason for this detailed document. So again, this just gives you a sense of what the documents look like. Obviously, this is actually one of the more legible and easily readable documents in the collection. But it gives you a sense of the kind of things that, when you're doing research in colonial Latin America, these are the kind of documents that you hope to find. So with that as a kind of preface, let me talk about the entrada. In the early 1690s, the Spanish settlers living in the foothills of the Andes of Western Venezuela and Eastern Colombia were both nervous and angry. Their prosperity depended on the production of staple crops like cacao and sugarcane, and unimpeded trade with the Atlantic world via the river systems flowing through the area, Lake Maracaibo, and thence the Atlantic Ocean. But they faced a growing problem of indigenous insurgency. Groups of unconquered Native Americans threatened their properties, threatened their agricultural output, and threatened their ability to trade. And one group in particular, a group of people that the Spanish referred to as motilones, which translates to something like bad haircut, because they wore their hair in a distinctive and, to the Spanish eyes, somewhat odd fashion. The motilones lived in the mountains and forests south and southwest of Lake Maracaibo, and they had been in contact with the Spanish for some decades, perhaps as much as a century, but had never been completely subdued. And starting in the 1690s, they were becoming a serious problem. So much so that in 1691, the Audiencia in Santa Fe de Bogota, an Audiencia is a sort of combination law court and governing body. And the Audiencia in Bogota was the governing body for the province or kingdom of El Nuevo Reino de Granada, the new kingdom of Granada, today roughly corresponding to the western part of Venezuela, Colombia, and a little bit of other territory in what is now Ecuador. Anyway, in 1691, the Audiencia in Bogota issued a decree instructing the inhabitants of the Spanish communities in the vicinity to carry out punitive raids against the Motilones. Now, a little bit of geography here again. This is an 18th century Spanish map, and it shows the southern shore of Lake Maracaibo and a couple of the major rivers that flow into the lake from the south. And you can see that from this map, it's a fairly mountainous area. And there are a number of Spanish settlements in the vicinity. Today, they can be found in the Andean states of Trujillo, Mérida, and Táchira, and the state of Zulia in western Venezuela. For our purposes today, the most important communities are the town or city of La Grita, which is located on this map right here. Here's La Grita. Sorry, mouse is not working very well. San Cristobal, and in particular, the town of San Faustino de los Rios, located here. Now, in the 20th and 21st centuries, about half of this territory is on the Venezuelan side of the border. San Faustino is today in the easternmost part of northeastern Colombia. So it's right near the Venezuelan-Colombian border today. But at the time, it was all administered from Bogota. Okay, so in 1691, the Audiencia in Bogota issued a decree ordering attacks on the Motilones. And one of the communities that responded with greatest alacrity to this call was the town of La Grita here. La Grita was an agricultural town, very much dependent on the production of cacao, and the Motilones were interfering with their activities. The Motilones attacked their plantations to capture or to take captives of their own. They also sought metal tools and textiles, and they frequently attacked the Spanish in response to Spanish attacks on them. And La Grita and the properties owned by the inhabitants suffered greatly. So in 1694, the town of La Grita began sponsoring attacks, entradas they were called, entries, against the Motilones who lived to the north, to the west, to the southwest. So La Grita provided funds, they provided manpower, and they provided support in the form of Indian allies that they controlled. But the staging area that they relied on, the place where they staged their raids, was the Spanish villa or town of San Faustino de los Rios, located here. It was an outpost which itself had been founded only a few years earlier. And it had been founded precisely as an outpost from which to attack the hostile Motilones. Anyway, so starting in 1694, the inhabitants of La Grita began to fund expeditions, and the person they chose to lead the expeditions was a man named Rodrigo Ferreira de Almeida, which interestingly is a Portuguese name, although Almeida was, Ferreira de Almeida was born in the area. He was apparently of Portuguese ancestry. Anyway, he had some years before become the governor and captain general of the town of San Faustino de los Rios. And unlike other Spanish villas in the area, San Faustino did not have a council or a cabildo, didn't have other judges. He was pretty much the only authority in the town, along with his lieutenant governor. And Ferreira was the kind of go-to guy to lead entradas against the motilones. So in early 1699, he organized, with funding from La Grita, an entrada against the motilones to the west of San Faustino. The expedition that he put together consisted of probably a couple of dozen Spaniards from La Grita, from San Faustino, and perhaps from other towns like San Cristobal. But also in the expedition were a group of Native American allies known as the Chinatos. The Chinatos were a people who lived in the region, were native to the region, and who themselves had only recently been subdued by the Spanish, and the process of conversion of them to Christianity had begun. So the expedition that Ferreira led consisted of some Spaniards and probably a greater number of Chinatos Indians. The Chinatos were useful auxiliaries. They were skilled boatmen. And again, most travel in this area took place via water. There weren't any roads to speak of. And so the easiest way to get from point A to point B was by the river system. The Chinatos were also reputed to be ferocious warriors and therefore good allies. So the entrada that we're talking about departs from an Indian village called San Jose in the vicinity of San Faustino. If we look at this map, it's a little bit more detailed. Again, an 18th century Spanish map. Here we have San Faustino up here. San Jose, the jumping off point for this entrada, is located here. So the entrada departed, traveled west, and somewhere in this general area, and here we can see a notation, montañas habitadas por los indios motilones, mountains inhabited by the Motilon Indians. So somewhere in this area, some weeks of travel away from San Jose, presumably because of the difficulty of the terrain, the expedition encountered a village or settlement of Motilon Indians and attacked it. The attack was apparently led by the Chinatos, and the result of the attack was the capture of 9 Indians. We don't know if there were casualties. The documents are silent on the topic. What we do know is that the expedition captured 9 Indians. In fact, apparently the Chinatos, the Indian auxiliaries, were the ones who captured the Indians. Of the 9, 1 was an elderly man, 1 was an adult woman with a baby at the breast, and the remaining 6 were all young girls, running in age from toddlers to about 16 years of age. And all of these captives were seized. Governor Ferreira immediately ordered the execution by hanging of the 1 adult male, perhaps because he was aged and infirm, perhaps for other reasons. So he was summarily hanged, and all of the remaining captives, the adult woman, the male child, the male infant, and the girls were all taken back to San Jose de los Rios, an Indian village in the jurisdiction of San Faustino. So again, a fairly typical, apparently, entrada. captives taken, brought back to an area under Spanish control. What happens next is very interesting. The Chinatos, these recently conquered Indians, kept the captives initially as slaves themselves. Apparently, the Chinatos spoke a language that was intelligible to the Motilones, so they could communicate with them. The Chinatos were in the process of being converted to Christianity, and there was a Dominican friar, Fray Agustin de Osorio, who was along on the expedition and who took over the spiritual took over responsibility for the spiritual well-being of these captives to see that they were converted to Christianity. But soon after the Indians took their captives back to San Jose, Governor Ferreira stepped in and confiscated all 8 of them and took them from San Jose to San Faustino de los Rios, the Spanish town in the vicinity. And the captives were all distributed to Spanish residents, vecinos of San Faustino de los Rios. So Governor Ferreira assigned the Indians 2 specific Spanish settlers while keeping at least 1 for himself. Over the next couple of months, out of the 8, 3 died. 1, the 16-year-old girl, died of unknown causes, probably disease. The fate of the other 2 that passed away, the adult woman and her infant son, is much sadder. Apparently, according to various accounts, the adult woman was so despondent and hated the Spanish so much that rather than see her son brought up as a servant, she killed the baby and buried it. Some days after that, she herself was discovered one morning dead, perhaps a suicide, perhaps perhaps of disease. But what the accounts agree on was that she hated the Spanish. She refused even to speak to them. She acted as if they didn't exist, and again, she died. Now, the baby, once discovered, because she had killed her son and then buried the baby was disinterred, taken to consecrated ground, baptized after death by Father Osorio, and then buried. The woman, though, was simply taken out into the fields and dumped, presumably because she was not a Christian. And here's where things get very complicated, because Father Osorio, the Dominican friar who was in charge of missionary activities among the Chinatos and also among the Motilones, filed a complaint against the governor because of the governor's removal of the Indian children. In his complaint, he asserted that the children should be returned to him, that all of the captives should be given back to him so that he could make sure that they convert to Christianity. At about the same time, however, various of the Chinatos, including the 2 caciques or chiefs of Chinato villages in the vicinity, also complained against the governor. And this is why we have this vast volume of legal documents, because those complaints sent to the Audiencia in Bogota resulted in the Audiencia sending a judge, a man named Juan de Salazar, to San Faustino de los Rios to conduct an investigation. And between June of 1699 and September or October, Juan de Salazar conducted interrogations of Spanish vecinos, Indians from San Jose and other Indian communities, the governor, and Father Osorio. And the account that emerges from these interrogations and this testimony tells us a great deal about society and the economy, and in particular about Indian-Spanish relations in the area. Father Osorio's interest was having the 8 captives returned to his control. But the Chinatos complaints were much broader. They complained about the removal of the captives, but they also accused the governor of treating them cruelly and badly. They accused him of forcing them to work for him, in particular, paddling canoes between San Faustino and the Lake Maracaibo port of Gibraltar. So he would force them to paddle canoes for him. Well, first he'd force them to make the canoes, then to paddle them so that they could haul cargo from Gibraltar to San Faustino and from San Faustino to Gibraltar, all without paying them or feeding them. They also accused him of smuggling, bringing in contraband, including clothes and cane liquor, which he would sell to the Indians at very high prices. They also accused him of extorting from them. The Chinatos were producing their own cacao, and Governor Ferreira allegedly required them to sell their cacao to him at artificially low prices. And Governor Ferreira also blocked any other Spaniard from trading with the Indians and paying them higher prices. They even accused him of having pocketed money that they raised for the beautification of their church. And they accused him of seizing cacao haciendas that they had established and not paying for. In the end, and I know I'm running kind of a little bit short on time here, so let me summarize. In the end, we don't know the final outcome. We do know that Juan de Salazar, the judge, almost immediately ordered the embargo of Ferreira's property, basically took his property in charge, and exiled him physically from San Faustino to the nearby Spanish town of Salazar de las Palmas down here. So moved him from here to here and told him, you cannot come back to San Faustino until the case is settled. The surviving 5 Indian captives were returned to the control of Father Osorio. We don't know what happens to them after that. And it does seem that at least in the early 1700s, Ferreira de Almeida, the governor of San Faustino, is no longer in possession of his post. He's been deposed and a new governor has been put in place. Okay, so in a couple of minutes, let me sum up what I think are the most salient and significant takeaways from this specific event. It tells us a great deal about Indian-Spanish relations and why the 18th century, at least up through the 1770s, was characterized by unending low-level, what today we would call low-intensity conflict between the Spanish and the Motilones. The Spanish persistently and consistently blamed the Motilones for the hostilities, saying that the Motilones were depraved, evil, barbaric people, people who were, in the words of one Spaniard, who had the heart of beasts. So they blamed the violence that ensued on the Indians, basically saying that the Indians were cruel, violent, and that they had to be defeated militarily, perhaps even exterminated or deported, that is, rounded up and shipped to the Caribbean or to Mexico or somewhere else. And throughout the 1700s, up to the 1770s, the Spanish, both from the Andes and also from Maracaibo, would periodically launch entradas against the Motilones, trying to defeat them militarily. But like the 1699 entrada, most of these entradas seem to have had as a top priority, if not the priority, the capture of individual Indians, especially women and children, for enslavement. So this gives us a different perspective on the hostilities, right? The Motilones were hostile to the Spanish in large part because the Spanish kept attacking them and kidnapping their children, which gives you a different perspective. Another, I think, key takeaway from this entrada is that the relationship between the Spanish and the Indians throughout the colonial period in this area, like other frontier areas of the Spanish Empire, was based on the Spanish desire to control and exploit Indian labor. So one of the dynamics that shaped Indian-Spanish relations was the Spaniards' desire to exploit Indian labor for the benefit of the Spanish settlers, to put them to work producing saleable commodities, in particular cacao, and later on, increasingly sugarcane. And all of this is happening despite the fact that as early as 1542, the Spanish crown had attempted to outlaw the enslavement of Indians. Starting with the passage of the new laws of the Indies in 1542, theoretically, enslaving Indians was prohibited under any circumstances. And yet, in the area west of and south of Lake Maracaibo, it went on all the time. Now, those of you who know something about New Mexico history know that New Mexico was also an area where the enslavement of Indians continued throughout the colonial period and even into the 19th century. So as in many frontier regions like the southwest of North America, despite legal prohibitions, indigenous peoples continued to be subjugated and forced into unfree labor. And a final takeaway, I think, has to do with the Chinatos, who were a people apparently akin to the Motilones, speaking a related language, being able to communicate with them, and so on, and themselves only recently subdued by the Spanish, starting probably in the middle of the 1600s. So again, relatively recently conquered. And yet by the time of the entrada and the subsequent legal dispute, the Chinatos owned Indian slaves, were growing cacao, and as the documents demonstrate, were making use of the Spanish legal system to try to redress their problems with Governor Ferreira. And this is important because one of the things that we really lack in Latin America generally, and in the history of Venezuela in particular, we don't really have all that sophisticated an understanding of rural life and rural society in the colonial period. And so episodes like the entrada of Governor Ferreira in 1699 shed some interesting light on the complex dynamics of colonial society and the way in which Indians, Spaniards, people of mixed race, and although I don't mention them in this presentation, African slaves and their descendants form a very complex society. I've talked probably longer than I should, so I will stop here and see if there are any questions that people have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Linder. So if you'd like to ask a question, just unmute or put something in the chat. I don't see anything in the chat right now. So how long has this research taken you, and do you anticipate having to do more research before you work on your book?
Well, I'm at work. Well, second question first. I am at work on the book. I've got a couple of very rough drafts of chapters. I've got actually 3 chapters kind of roughed out of an anticipated 9 or 10. So the book is well long. Will I have to do a few more research? Absolutely. Again, one of the pitfalls of being a historian is that you never finish your research. research is endless and ongoing. At certain points, though, you have to arbitrarily say, I've got to stop for now and do, and write some of this stuff up. And as Carol can tell you, that's probably my Achilles heel as a historian. I love the research a lot. The writing, not quite so much. So I've got, a lot of research that I'm still trying to get written up, going back a long time. This particular research project, I began around 2014, and it came in response to the problematic state of U.S.-Venezuelan relations. The last time I was able to go to Venezuela to do research was 2012. I was supposed to go in 2014, but by that time, U.S.-Venezuelan relations had deteriorated to the point where my friends in Venezuela were saying, don't come. It's dangerous and you shouldn't come. At that time, there were some upheavals that, and right about the same time, it became impossible to get there because flights couldn't be had. So I was sort of trying to figure out, okay, well, what do I do? I'm a 19th and 20th century Venezuelan historian. The documents are in Venezuela. Well, then I got the bright idea, well, why don't you start working in colonial history? Because those documents are available outside of Venezuela. A lot of them you can find at the Archivo General de Indias in Spain. And I apologize to the interpreters, I'm talking very fast. So you can find documents in Spain and you can find documents in Colombia. And so I started thinking about, well, why not colonial research? And so I began to do some preliminary work using published primary sources and secondary sources. And I immediately came face to face with the situation that I'm really not a colonial historian. The research that I did for my dissertation in the 1980s in Maracaibo, some of the documents I was reading were actually typewritten. And, you sort of compare those to, that. And believe me, this is among the more legible documents that I've looked at. So I've had to kind of reinvent myself. And I've been in the process of doing that, sort of converting from a national period historian to a colonialist over the space of about the last 7 years. So again, very much a work in progress, but and again, research is problematic also because of the pandemic. I was supposed to go to Spain in the summer of 2020, and that didn't work out. I was going to try to go to Spain this last spring. Pandemic got in the way of that. Luckily for me, both the AGI in Sevilla and the AGN in Colombia have digitized not all, not even most of, but at least parts of their documentary collections. And so I was able to do some research. And again, it's endless. I just found a couple of days ago another bundle of about 250 pages worth of documents, which from the Chinatos, focusing more on their specific grievances against Governor Ferreira. So,
Dr. Linder,
yeah,
you've got a couple questions.
Okay.
Keith Tucker has his hand up, Dr. Tucker, and then Ruby was on, but I think she had to jump off for a second, and so
Okay.
she may come back.
Sorry, again, I like the sound of my own voice. Keith.
Dr. Linder, thank you very much for that presentation. Although the names mean nothing to me, the history as you presented it, it was not a happy history, but it was very factual, and I would give you an A+ if I was grading you. But my question is, where do you find these documents? How are they maintained after 250 years? Who has these?
Well, again, one of the nice things about the Spanish Empire from a historian's point of view is that they liked bureaucracy. So they did documents in triplicate. And so and while there has been a lot of document loss over the centuries, most Latin American countries have done a decent job of preserving them. And now since the late 20th century, most countries have invested a sizable resources in preserving their documents and increasingly in digitizing them or microfilming them so that they're available and again, so that they don't deteriorate by being handled by one historian after another. And so again, most countries have a sort of central archive for the country. And for the colonial period, since all of this was part of the Spanish Empire, the General Archive of the Indies, the Archivo General de Indias in the city of Sevilla, has a huge documentary collection. And so that's pretty much where you find the documents. And again, fortunately for me, in the context of the pandemic, both the AGI and the AGN in Colombia have done a very good job of making stuff available online. You can't find everything, but you can find a good deal. I don't know if that answers your question.
But, I thank you very much. And that was, is it written in Castilian Spanish? What kind of Spanish is it written in?
It is in Castilian Spanish, but again, it's Castilian Spanish of the late 17th century. And so the paleography is sometimes difficult. Again, I selected this because it was probably the most readable or among the most readable of the documents. And what it is, you
You're
can
not
see.
still sharing, honey. I know you're
I'm not?
referring to that, but you're not sharing anymore.
Oh, sorry about that.
No worries.
Where would I be without you?
I don't know.
Okay, so here are the documents that I'm talking about. And you can if you read Spanish, you can see this is a petition. It's actually the petition by Fray Agustín de Osorio, the Dominican friar. And it's his petition to have the 8 captive Indians returned to him. It mentions that he was part of the expedition, that the Indians had initially been sent to the Indian village, but then they were taken away by the governor. He wants them back. So that's Osorio's petition.
Okay. Very nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I think Ruby had a question. Ruby, if you're still there, if you'd like to ask your question.
Yeah, sorry, I had a phone call. I was just wondering if you're interested in looking into any of the older, we're part of a land grant. It's called the Anton Chico Land Grant. And we have a lot of documents like these, and we just wondered if you would ever be interested in checking some of them out.
I would be very interested. I mean, the Anton Chico Land Grant has had a long and complex history, and I again, I've done a little bit of work on the history of land grants. Actually, when I was an undergraduate, I did a study of the Abiquiu land grant. So yeah, I would be interested in looking at the documents.
Okay. Maybe we can get some to you one of these days. I'll talk to the president and see what he wants to send over.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I had one question, Peter. You know,
Sure.
in your history, you've talked and looked at coerced labor in the past, but when you've looked at coerced labor in this region in the past, has it been primarily women and children that were being sort of in this coerced labor, not officially slavery, but in that situation? Or was this, I know this document, you hadn't seen anything like this before, but when you've looked at coerced labor in other areas, is it similar?
Yeah, again, and not just in the context of Venezuela. It's not always women and children. Adult men are incorporated into these systems, but adult men are often difficult to deal with. They tend to be large, and in the case of unconquered Indians, frequently have military skills. And that makes them dangerous to enslave. And so in many areas, men are sent off to the kind of work that uses them up quickly, whereas women and children, because women are physically weaker, they're also useful for their productive capacity and also for their reproductive capacity. They're usually kept in households, and children, can be brought up in the household, assimilated into the Spanish culture, and incorporated as sort of a dependent layer in colonial society. So it's not exclusively women and children, but women and children tend to be sort of easier to deal with, and you're more likely to keep them around. So that, again, if we look at the context of, say, 17th century New Mexico before the Pueblo Revolt, the various Spanish governors in that case would lead entradas against especially the Apache, the Navajo, and the Ute. They would capture Indians, but again, priority given to women and children. Adult men would be sent as slaves down to the mines in Chihuahua, while women and children would be incorporated into Spanish households as servants. Women and girl children as maids, cooks, and so on. Male children sent off into the fields to become sort of cultivators, herders, and so on. And there's been some really wonderful work, depressing but wonderful work, on Indian slavery in the context of the Southwest, starting with James Brooks's book, Captives and Cousins, which looks at sort of the economic flows of slaves and livestock throughout the Southwest from the 1600s to the 1800s. And then a recent book by Andres Reséndez called The Other Slavery, which is a sort of encyclopedic treatment of Indian slavery in the New World, but again, focusing primarily on the Southwest. So yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. And again, it's very context specific, but women and children were particularly prized because they were less dangerous than adult men usually. And again, women could both be productive, that is, they were expected to work, had work skills from their lives among indigenous peoples, but they were also valued reproductively because they could be impregnated willingly or not, and the subsequent children would be available for labor too.
Are there any other questions for Dr. Linder?
Well, thanks very much for your attention. I really enjoyed it. Hopefully it wasn't too dull.
I think you're getting thumbs ups.
Well, thank you.
Was there a lot of impregnation from the masters? Would they be the masters of them to these Indian women? And then
Yeah.
they use these children as slaves?
Yeah, again, and without sort of overdrawing the comparison, you can compare it to, say the lives of African and African descended women in slave societies throughout the Americas, not only the antebellum South here in the United States, but also in Brazil, the Caribbean, and so on. Usually, the status of the mother determined the status of the child. So if a woman who is a slave, either formally, as in the case of African Americans or Afro-Venezuelans or whatever, or informally, the child would have the status of the mother. And so again, Indian slaves would be available sexually, willingly or not, to the Spanish heads of household, and their mixed race children would be part of the household, usually in a sort of low status position. So yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Linder, for your time and your expertise today. And we'll be looking forward to your talk next year.